That's fine. At my previous congregation in Virginia, if nobody would sit in front of us in the second row, and just wait till it was all filled and move up the first row. I also had a rule that we always had a board member whose job it was to make announcements, to wishes to the congregation, but if there wasn't, if the person didn't show up, then I would choose the board member sitting furthest from the that's what you get. Little means of passive aggression from. Hi, Vivian. Shabbat shalom. We'll begin in just a few minutes. We wanted to keep things simple today. We've been doing a lot of Torah study by streaming or by Zoom at Fairmount Temple for a good while, and we'll be doing some of that too. There was so much messaging to get out this week. We decided to keep it simple on our staff and just focus on in-person and streaming for today, because tracking down everybody who needs the Zoom link is kind of a challenge during a week like this.
So where do you go for Zoom link?
So we'll be following up soon on that. We're just, like I was saying last night, we're just barely gotten our emails up and running.
So people who Zoom the service, where do they go?
No, they went to live stream. It's not. No, right through the website. Yeah, our live streaming link was live last night. Lots of people were streaming, but in terms of in this morning, both here and in Rabbi Klein's Torah study, which is focusing on the prophet Amos today, we have streaming available. So I know it's one way, but for all of you who have begun to stream with us, because it's just a couple minutes after 9, we'll be starting in just a minute. I wouldn't normally stand before a microphone for a group that could hear me this way, but I'm trying to make sure that the folks who are streaming can as well. And this is not for dramatic effect. This is because I asked Cantor Sibo has a wedding rehearsal right after us this morning, and so I asked her if we could sneak into the chapel for this time until she arrives with her couple.
It's a very elegant couple.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's really lovely. Sometimes the simplest is the best. You ever have that when you attend a wedding, and as amazing as everyone looks, they don't look anything remotely like they do in general? And it's, to each person their own, but it's nice when it's simple and beautiful.
I have to tell you, Rabbi, I almost got to see a former convent of yours, Bonnie Millender.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, she was a classmate of mine, and we had a trip planned, and we hadn't seen each other for probably 55 years. And we were going to meet, and I was very excited about it.
Here in Cleveland?
No, in the Boston area.
Okay. She has roots here too. Bonnie's daughter Lori is one of my wife's best friends.
Is that right?
Yep.
Oh my gosh.
Yep.
She went to camp with my daughter back in the day.
Alrighty.
Yeah, it's a lot of connections.
For sure.
As is often the case.
It's a great claim to fame, the Millender family, for me. Yeah, I agree. It can be. It can be. It's a lot of fun to figure out who connects to whom and from where. I'm going to distribute some study sheets for us. I prepared some text study sheets, and some folks commonly might bring their own Torah commentaries and the like. But I want to mention that my hope today was to allow our Torah study to help us lay the groundwork for what it's like to begin to establish sacred community, to gather together in sacred spaces and to form community bonds and to discern what are the norms of a community. This is exactly where we are. We are, how do I put it? At a time where there's so much tumult, frankly, in the world, it's quite lovely to be involved with something right at the seed planting time, nurturing something right now. And so Torah study today, while using this week's parasha as its point of departure, is really trying to lift up some of the mixed emotions that emerge when we are responding to and discerning our role and our recognition of where we stand next to the leaders around us who are developing and helping us form those immediate norms. It's customary before we study Torah to offer a word of blessing, and so bless you, of course, but also the blessing for setting an intention for the study of Torah begins like most every other Jewish blessing with that formula, Baruch atah Adonai, etc., etc. The last three words are la'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. It's a great joy to be able to spend this first part of Shabbat morning with you. It is our intention, not only today, but over the coming weeks and months in our new congregation, Mishkan Or, to more fully flower in the realm of our Shabbat morning practice. It is our intention to do so carefully, thoughtfully, and to try and engender opportunities for more of our congregants to explore study and prayer and mitzvot and other special experiences on Shabbat. As I was mentioning informally to folks before we began, we wanted to keep it as simple as possible today because from a messaging standpoint, we want to make sure folks could join us in person. Others are streaming with us. We promise you there'll be other opportunities to connect by Zoom as well. For today, it's just, it's good to be alive and good to be having that opportunity to busy ourselves in words of Torah. The source text for our study is the first 4 verses of our portion. Chapter 16 of the book of Numbers tells us a tale that's pretty familiar in the book of Numbers. Last night, as I was teaching the congregation and trying to offer, I hope, a sense of inspiration about the direction we could go, I began with a story about kvetching. And the reason is because this entire book of Torah could be called Sefer Kvetch, if we were to be honest about it, the book of Kvetch. As the Israelites are traveling in the wilderness, they are tested numerous times by kvetching and moaning and grumbling, folks remembering and misremembering how awesome it was back in Egypt, because out here they're struggling to figure out if they'll ever get to a promised land. They're turning to God and saying, they're turning to Moses and saying, did God take us out here to kill us? You know, they are difficult, they are irascible, and there's no book on the airport bookstore shelf about how to deal with difficult people that could quite approximate what it's like for Moses to contend with them. It would otherwise seem awkward if it wasn't, if there weren't such beautiful and thoughtful commentaries around this portion to try and wrap ourselves around how this portion could help us illustrate and teach to ourselves what kind of norms do we want to establish in a new community. But we can do it. We can try it. I brought along some commentaries that I think are thoughtful in that way. I will, again, for the sake of streaming, I'll do a little bit more of the reading than I might normally do for folks who are at home. But when we are interacting, which is my hope throughout the session, you'll just notice a little bit of extra me repeating your question before we discuss it, so that we can help everybody to stay connected. The passage here are the very first verses of the book. Vayikach Korach ben Yitzchar. Now Korach, son of Izchar, son of Kohath, son of Levi, betook himself. This is going to be a key verse in the portion. Betook himself, along with Dotan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, and On, son of Peleth, descendants of Reuben. What did they do? Vayakumu lifnei Moshe. They rose up against Moses. There are commentaries I don't have before you where Vayakumu is translated as not rose up, but crushed. And this is because of sort of I might be using a sort of a sports term here, forward trajectory. They're imposing on him. They arose, but lunging toward him, toward Moses, together with 250 Israelites, chieftains of the community, chosen in the assembly, men of repute. Again, relying on my memories of just last night's Shabbat service, where before worship, we discerned that to establish a new community together, we really should enter the sanctuary together. We gathered outside the sanctuary and kept people from entering in advance, to get their seat, and but also so that we could ritualize the moment, to spend a moment blessing it, sanctifying that moment just before we would establish a sanctuary that is shared, and ritualizing it with words, with melodies, and with the call of the shofar before carrying Torahs into the sanctuary. I mention all of this as a beautiful contrast to some of the irritation provided to the ushers last night from folks who wanted in. But rising up against Moses was much more aggressive. It's one thing to get some friction as leader and people. It's another thing to get that sense of imposition, fighting, contending with essentially a rebellious force beyond which Moses might not have predicted or planned. One of the reasons that the Torah text tells us all of the descendants and all of the names here is that it's helping us. If you look at it in the broader scheme and you look at all of these names, you'll see that Korach is a cousin of Moses. He's that cousin. The one at Thanksgiving that you're wondering what's he going to be like this year, right? He's that cousin. Looking for, perhaps imagining in advance that there will be an issue to leap on and taking it as soon as possible. But it says here that Korach betook himself. In other words, grabbed himself. Grabbed meaning like lifted up himself. And one of the pieces that I find interesting here is that his actual accusation against Moses is going to be that Moses is lifting up himself. Has anybody here ever seen someone accuse others of exactly what they were doing as they were accusing it?
It might be a presidential candidate.
Certainly, you'd have to look back, Steve, very far in history, a presidential candidate perhaps in another nation, where let's just hypothetically say someone might accuse someone of being braggadocious while actually bragging, or something along those lines. It's difficult, it's irascible, and it's worse when it's your relative. Don't you think? It's worse. There's a sense of betrayal, a sense of insight that feels nastier. There's a premise that I think we live with among our families, most of us, which is that you should have told me. You could have approached me. The least you could have done is speak to me about your concerns instead of calling together 250 behind you to rebel against me and moving forward, lunging at me to crush me, right? I think that's a legitimate question for leaders and communities. And by the way, we take turns, don't we? In the modern Jewish community, we take turns. The official leaders are often following the lead of those who in another setting might be their students or their followers. We each have roles to play, and that's what makes it so exciting. We are partners. But we count on, and I hope that as we start to form a congregation, we'll be able to count on a flow of communication that's based on the premise that we don't have to humiliate or embarrass or contend in public with one another. That isn't to say that a little amount of friction is bad, or that one couldn't resort to such circumstances, to using social justice organizing terms, to pull an action on someone who's in leadership. But I think that the ideal is a situation where we can negotiate privately, where we can speak to each other so that we know where we stand. And he's a what? Yes, an inciter, right? C-I-T-E-R, is that what you're saying? No. Oh, he's an insider. Thank you. Thank you. So he has an inside track. Korach could have spoken directly to Moses, or at least back-channeled his concerns, right? It is something that I won't hide from anyone. As a modern rabbi, I am straddling the fact that rabbis over the ages, and certainly and especially over the ages from when any of us, should we have connected with rabbis early in our lives and known them through other generations, there was a shift happening that has markedly happened even more so over the last 30 years, which is that rabbis were once primarily adjudicators with more or less judicial authority over disputes. That's the kind of leadership that Moses shows as Moshe Rabbeinu. Moses, our teacher, Moses, our rabbi, right, is adjudicating disputes. And not only disputes, but questions and concerns, things that dig deeper into our story and the meaning of being in relationship with one another and with God. Having adjudicatory authority, it remains to be true in a number of segments of the traditional Jewish community, but even the most ultra-religious have been influenced by modernity enough that they see what we see on full blast, I would say, among liberal or progressive denominations of Judaism, which is more of a persuasive authority, pastoral care, investment in people's lives and experiences, and then, of course, spiritual enlightenment have become a bigger portion of a rabbi's influence, but it's not adjudicatory. There was a situation in my own family where one of my relatives, his previous spouse and children from his first marriage are ultra-Orthodox. He was briefly ultra-Orthodox with them, but they remained so after a divorce and continuing on. And when he went to remarry, the members of his family turned to their rabbi for questions of permission. Could they attend a wedding service more or less where I'm standing right now? And the answer was no. I won't get into the specifics of my concern at the time, but suffice it to say the words on my lips were not repeatable on a microphone for folks streaming or in a chapel, because it seemed to me like it was contravening such a primary principle of honoring one's father. And yet, the adjudicatory authority was saying, no, that is a category, beyond reproach. You can't go there. As you may know from every Disney movie known to man, whenever someone says, "You must not go there," that's when we get excited to go there all the more, right? But ultimately, a solution was drawn where the wedding was held in a Jewish setting, but not inside of a Reform synagogue, which made sense for everybody. But it still was tough to accept that sense of adjudicatory authority. Not that they would have been penalized precisely, but that they wouldn't have thrown over that authority. It had a very different space than your average influential or persuasive authority. Steve?
The thought comes to mind that the adjudicatory authority, for what purpose? And in many cases, it's community building or community protection. And so in the same sense, Reform and conservative rabbis are also not just in the pastoral setting, but also community builders.
Yeah, so Steve's mentioning how the role of building community influences this quite a lot, and that often building community involves a certain amount of actions determined on the basis of protection of community norms, protection of literally physical protection, assets that the rabbinic leader sees in place. And so it's not that there aren't any rules, any guidelines. There are boundaries, but their ability to determine the direction of the community has changed quite a lot. I'm mentioning that on purpose now because, after all, we are forming a community where half the community doesn't know 3/4 of the rabbis. When I say doesn't know, meaning, as Rabbi Klein shared last night, may have some allusion to, may have a face that looks familiar, but to begin, I'll throw it out there straight to you. To knock gently on a hospital door to visit someone who is infirm and be a virtual stranger, as if a virtual stranger's visit is expected to be an important and thoughtful visit, is a challenge. And yet, it's a challenge worth addressing. It's one worth lifting up in a transparent fashion. Whether you are well known to the person you're visiting or not, even if they knew you were on your way and you just called them, the appropriate thing to say when you arrive at the door of the hospital is, would it be okay for me to visit? Right? There's a sense of invitation, request, that may have been initially summoned, but then in the moment giving someone some space and time to recognize, wait a minute, maybe I'm not ready for this. And that's part of what's some apprehension, is part of what's in the air, at the same time as excitement, opportunity. The goal of the discussions around merging our two temples, after all, was to ask, could 1 + 1 equal 3 or more? Hence, you see how we have multiple opportunities this morning to study Torah, because we want to offer different approaches, different texts, and different commentaries. I want to finish the source text because it really gets to the deep sense of conflict that arises when Korach lifts himself up and takes 250 key leaders to rise up against Moses, men of repute. They combine against Moses and Aaron and say to them, you have gone too far. For all the community are holy, all of them, and Adonai is in their midst. Why then do you raise yourself above Adonai's congregation? So again, I'm not 100% sure what is running through Moses' mind as that accusation is hurled at him. But the Torah text is quite clear what he does next, and it's not the only time it's going to happen in the book of Numbers. Vayishma Moshe, Moses heard this, Vayipol al panav, and he fell on his face. What's that mean to you when someone falls on their face at an accusation? They're demonstrating their sense of being distraught. Yeah, it's a physical demonstration. What might it look like? I mean, is it literally like, do we imagine like literally falling on his face, or is it a metaphor? Yeah, it's probably a metaphor for a look of being kind of out of sorts, disbelief. How could this be happening? Not just you, Cora, you're always agitating, but with 250 of the key leaders, you got all of them, right? You got them to play this game, this not unfair misuse of the rules. Vivian?
I'm just thinking about the modern Hebrew expression, ala panim.
Yeah.
They use it in Israel, meaning just totally destroyed.
Yeah. You destroyed me. Yeah, exactly. It's actually pretty hard to translate it. It's one of those phrases that requires a colloquial use to understand, and yet when we look at, that's the exciting piece about having a modern state of Israel where Hebrew's been revived, is that we, where it's not our native language, but it's our sacred language, we're looking for meaning all the time in every ounce of Hebrew words we hear, and some of those words are kind of coarse words, or they're words that aren't easily translatable because they're part of the modern language revived. I often tell people when they're considering visiting Israel, I'll often, as a demonstration of what it might be like to meet Israelis around whose homes you are touring, I'll gather a group and we'll go over to a neighbor. I mean, of course, I'll speak to the neighbor before we do it, and we'll gather around and we'll circle around like the hose spigot. And I'll point to it and say, what do you suppose the people inside are doing? And just use what you're seeing from this spigot to tell me, what do you think is happening here, right? That's a little bit what it's like to be examined on the world stage the way Israel and Israelis are, as a source of such interest, insight, yes, criticism, but also archaeological interest and meteorological interest and every kind of interest. It's over-inspected, right? Let me just look at this spigot and wonder what would the people in this community in centuries past have done with this, right? I mean, you can imagine what that might be like at your own home. That might be what it's like to live in a society that's subject to attention. So the commentaries that I've brought today on purpose are all from leading women in the rabbinate, all of whom have influenced my rabbinate greatly. Rabbi Laura Geller is the retired rabbi of Temple Emmanuel in Beverly Hills. She's actually, in her retirement, published a book about the meaning of aging. And she spoke at Fairmount Temple just a couple of years ago. She's a dear friend of Cantor Laureate Sager. But Rabbi Geller, prominent leader in the Los Angeles community, and she offers as follows. What makes this portion so problematic is that it seems that Korach could be in the right. After all, what is he asking for? Democracy, equality, empowerment? What's wrong with that? But seriously, what's the message here? Is it that authority can never be challenged? Given the reality of politics in our world, that's a dangerous and not very Jewish position. Is it that dissent in a religious community should be smashed? Also, not a good lesson, particularly at this moment in history when we see so much abuse of power by religious leaders. And the question is even more problematic, she points out, when you see how our tradition embellishes on the story. So the embellishments that she's describing is rabbinic interpretation. This is actually the touchstone of where we are invited as modern Jews. Most of the practices, insights that we've derived that are the core of our ethical and spiritual practice in Jewish life today are derived from rabbinic teachings, commentaries on the original text. Some of which could be dismissed as embellishments, others could say they're being improved as embellishments or examined more closely or through different angles that way. But Midrash of the rabbis embellishes upon the story, according to Rabbi Geller. In the rabbinic tradition, Korach is even more dangerous than he appears in the biblical story. The Midrash tells us not only did Korach challenge Moses, He also challenged Torah by criticizing laws that seem to be arbitrary and illogical. Don't turn the page just yet. Let's name a few. What laws, when you think about Jewish life, as we're getting acquainted with each other, what laws seem to you to be arbitrary? Or customs, experiences seem to be illogical, arbitrary. What sort of stands out? What's that? Shotness. Can you explain what shotness is?
You're not allowed to wear a garment that's made of combined fibers from, well, presumably from an animal and from a plant, right? Wool and linen.
Anybody wearing more than one form of yarns today? You're all going to be stoned to death. No, teasing. But yes, it seems arbitrary. This mixing question, the categories are clearly important to the ancients. The Bible is loaded with prohibitions. Clearly, the ancients wanted this text of the Bible to be about what they could or could not do, what was permissible and not permissible. And yet it does seem arbitrary to us when we look at it from a modern stance. Yeah. What was the reasoning? Was that? Yeah, a lot of it was this is what we've learned from God. A lot of it was driven from biblical verses that state it clearly. Now, what does that make sense? It means that in a world today where we have come to respect, I don't want to say affirm, because while I may affirm this, a lot of folks are in process with it. In a world today where we have come to affirm the idea that not all equations are binary, this or that, male or female, smart, not smart, right? I don't actually like the terms good and bad that well. Nice. When a student of Torah is preparing their bar mitzvah, and I'll ask them, let's talk about your character here. If you were thinking about your values and someone was speaking about you, what would you like them to say about you? And if they'll say, I'd like them to say I was nice. I'll say, how? How are you nice? Nice itself doesn't tell me anything. I want to know more, because I see the world having more than just black and white. But the ancients were trying to keep categories separate. And you can see that in multiple cases, shotness being just one of them. What else seems arbitrary and illogical?
I'm just going to comment on Vivian's point.
Mm-hmm.
The fringes, right, for wool. Presumably the tunic
Yeah.
probably is not. So there's an exception to that.
You're talking about the fringe, elsewhere, right, the tzitzit, the fringes that were commanded elsewhere just a few chapters ago in the book of Numbers were commanded to wear tzitzit, but the actual tunic is not a requirement to fulfill. It's the fringes, right? So arguably you could tie fringes to your belt loops today and be all right. Why then, because I'm a rabbi and you're stuck with me today, why not offer just a little extra piece of teaching? Why then don't people just wear a utilitarian, they call this a talit katan all the time? That is to say, just an undershirt that has fringes connected to it. Why wear an elegant, multicolored talasium? Well, it's not arbitrary. It's not illogical. Well, we wear these things in public, don't we? We want to look pretty. The concept here is hidur mitzvah. We beautify a mitzvah. We do so when we take that mitzvah and thoughtfully, creatively affirm it. I'm standing right in front of hidur mitzvah, and we just described before we began, it's simple, but it's a beautiful way to illustrate a concept where the chuppah, all it needs to be is a shelter that's open on all four sides. It could be just this wood, and it wouldn't quite carry the same glory. Hidur mitzvah. We see it all the time in creative renditions of prayers, in poetry and interpretation, in song. Last night, Cantor Sibo and Cantor Lappin combined for a musical mashup of Shalom Rav and Somewhere Over the Rainbow, which literally beckoned a rainbow that we saw immediately following services, each end of it. And I'm going to tell you, that rainbow is going to get bigger over time. as people describe it, right? And by the way, as digital photography continues to embellish upon it. But Hidur Mitzvah is one way to strengthen the memory that comes with connecting to a mitzvah. And so, yeah, it could be, I know I got there into a big digression, but Chad was talking about that the wool of the tzitzit, you know, how does that connect to shatnez of the mixing of the different categories? It's very problematic because the notion that Korach is not just taking on Moses, but taking on the whole tradition upon which Moses stands is worthy from the ancient rabbi's point of view of excusing or permitting his severe punishment. Korach is punished in a pretty severe way, is he not? We're not looking at these verses, but ultimately the earth opens and swallows him up. Now, I don't know. The composers of Torah may have been familiar with what a sinkhole looks like, or another kind of natural occurrence like that, an earthquake. Or they may have been imagining a punishment as severe as this. It's not just Korach, but these rebels. All of his followers go down with him. Imagine the blow that must have been to Moses. Almost worse than putting up with the rebellion, losing all of those men of repute, all of those chieftains, all of those people of respect. After all, the man fell on his face not just because his cousin gave him a hard time. He fell on his face because the entire assembly that he was using in order to govern 600,000 kvetching Israelites was in terrible disrepair in front of him. So if you turn to the next page, page 2, the Midrash views Korach as mocking religious authority, worse, accusing Moses and Aaron of using their authority to impoverish poor people by requiring that they offer sacrifices and tzedakah. If this is the rabbi's vision of Korach, no wonder he's the epitome of a threat. But why create these interpretive stories about Korach? What use do they have? Now let's think about that for a moment, because I don't want to suggest that it is always excusable to create more drama over, more interpretation of, to perseverate over the various ways that someone has shown disrespect in order to justify their harsh punishment. Certainly not the way I want to start leading in a sacred community together, is to do so out of the sense that if you question religious authority, you should be put to death. Hardly so. But what use do such stories have when you think about it as a human response? In other words, when we are angry, when we are fierce, where does that figure in, that we create kind of more backstory to the incidents that we're following? Archie?
It seems to me, and I haven't read, that Korah isn't necessarily doing this to replace Moses, but he seems to be doing this because he would rather have rule by committee.
Yeah.
Which is a recipe for chaos, which is totally unnecessary in this journey. That's what I see. He's not, like you say, binary. It's either him or me.
Yeah.
He's saying it's not necessary to have a him.
Okay, so Archie's saying it may not need to have the kind of hierarchical authority where Moses is the singular panim el panim, face-to-face leader with Moses, with God, right? Where that authority emerges from a singular leader. Maybe a whole group could lead. And you suggested that that's a recipe potentially for disaster. Yeah. You've been known to have an opinion or two.
I saw something else that unfortunately I might have learned from you, but...
Unfortunately? Thanks, Arch.
As long as they reference
Yeah.
I have a favorite, and it's Rabbi Eliezer when he says when you get too close to the top, that you can get burned very badly.
Yeah.
And it seems as though that's what Korach was doing here. He's getting a little too close to the fire.
Yeah. Like Moses' nephews, Nadav and Abihu, who in Leviticus don't just get too close to the fire, but they start a fire that they weren't commanded to do on the altar, and they too get poof, get killed on the spot. There's a serious punishment. It's punitive. This is not the rabbinic version of the death penalty. This is the Bible's version, which is a pretty severe threat intended to be imposed, I would think, by the composers of the Bible, but the rabbis actually put the brakes on that. As to say, they create a lot of legal loopholes that have to be in place for the imposition of death penalty, even against this kind of insurgency by Korach. Did you have a comment? Okay, I was just double checking. Yeah, Marcy.
Isn't Korach actually mocking and criticizing God when anything that comes from Moses comes from God? And that's what Korach is really objecting to, and that's what his punishment is for.
How do we know, Marcy, you mentioned that anything that's coming from Moses is coming from God, so he's really refuting God. But how do we know that? Who taught us that Moses is sort of the closest thing we get?
The Torah teaches us that.
Well, the Torah teaches us through Moses' own voice. When Moses is earlier questioned on his leadership, he says, "It's not me, I'm delivering God's message." This is seen by the biblical composers as a sign of maturity. When Moses is first approached with the role of determining the fate of Israelites, leading them out of slavery and towards freedom, his first response isn't, "I'll be your guy, God," right? His first response is, "Me? You don't want me." I mean, to that extent, it's paraphrasing, of course, but his humility also is, while being praised, his humility to the nth degree, is also a sign of his immaturity to the task. He's not ready. Some would say his humility shows his readiness, but what my point is to say, outwardly, he's not showing, "I'm ready to demonstrate that," until someone really goes after him on something he's delivered, and he says, this isn't me, this is God. It's something similar we saw before there was ever a Moses from Joseph in the Bible, in the stories in the book of Genesis. Joseph, as a child, was terribly immature, was dealing all the time with kind of grandiose ideas of what God had plans for him. But by the time Joseph matures and is in prison deciphering the dreams of fellow prisoners, and they look at him and they say, "I hear it said of you, no sooner is a dream told to you than you interpret it." Joseph says, "Biladi, Elohim ya'aneh et shalom paro." He says, "Not me. Only Elohim, only God answers the Pharaoh or anyone's sense of what their dreams or their nightmares are about." That is shown as a sign of maturity. Similarly for Moses. Yeah.
You were mentioning about the rabbis and commentaries trying to talk about Korach and shed some light on him. I've been biting my tongue because one of the things that I discovered this year, I mean, many years ago, I've read about the tzitzit and
Mm-hmm.
the blue and the mezuzot and the Torah scrolls.
Sure.
But this year, I learned that there's actually some of the rabbis compare him to the poor and bad guy.
Haman.
Not supposed to mention that.
Yeah, exactly.
So they said, they were comparing both, and basically what they said is the one thing that made them similar, number one is they were rich, because you know what they say about Korah, he had so many donkeys just to carry
Mm-hmm.
his treasures, and then this guy is paying millions and
Is all,
everything else. But
so Korach is in that interpretation, I mean, you said multiple things, but it's sort of a substitute for greed. Power, jealousy, when I say greedy, greedy for power, greedy for attention, greedy for authority, and it doesn't really have a formula. It's not exactly, maybe not exactly, let's rule by committee. I don't think actually Korach is interested in serving on a committee. After all, most of you aren't. As to say, committees are not typically what people volunteer for, and one of the comments I often make is that the prayer book that's designed by the committee, none of the committee members will use the prayer book. But
yeah, and he's not. He's selling himself as
mhm.
the people's chosen one. But he actually wants, at least from the text, I can derive that he wants that position badly.
Yeah, and this is where that, coming back to that phrase that he betook himself, it also leans, the reason I mentioned Joseph earlier was to remind myself to bring up Joseph in relationship to another passage in the Talmud where it describes, it says, 3 things shorten a man's life, by which I think they mean kind of start to decay a person's character, life, what have you. So it's not strictly about they cause their death, but it doesn't hurt to see it as that dramatic. 3 things shorten a man's life: to be offered a kos bracha, a kiddush cup, essentially, and refuse it; to be offered to hold a Sefer Torah, and to refuse that privilege; and then the last is essentially, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the Hebrew off the top of my head, I'll find it. And to, I've translated it as to follow one's own hype. To betake yourself, like Korach. And the answer, the rabbi says, well, who did that? And they say, Joseph. Joseph believed his own hype. That's their example. And that makes sense to me that that's a little bit here too. I'm up here to show that I could be where you are. I don't have to be, but you certainly shouldn't be. And you representing this idea that all people are not at equal level of holiness. Now it's interesting because the message that Moses is delivering on behalf of Adonai is that we are a mamlechet kohanim, a nation of priests, a goy kadosh, a holy nation, all of us equal. But the only entity in the Torah that's describing Moses as singular is God. Moses is not describing himself that way. The narrator of Torah and the narrator of Torah placing the words of God in is when God, again, in the book of Numbers, rebuking Miriam and Aaron for their gossip about Moses about 10 or 12 chapters ago, says, you wonder whether or not Moses has authority? He does. I only speak directly face to face with him. Everybody else, all the other prophets, I speak in dreams. Not so Moses. This is all words the composers of the Bible place in God's voice, not in Moses's. Yeah.
So I see Korach's complaint. I divided it into 2. The first one is we Christianity is told just what you just said, we're a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, and that's true.
Mm-hmm.
The second part is what you just said, is that why do you raise yourself above everybody else? Well, it's obvious that God has raised him above everybody else. And not only that, we already know that Moses is the most humble man that ever lived, according to the Torah. So that, to me, that's Korach's sin, that he wants to be raised up.
He wants to be raised up. Korach wants to be raised up like Moses, although we don't know that Moses is the most humble man on earth yet. That's going to describe him later. But why? Because he holds his own in these moments. Because he could very well go after Korach, and he doesn't. I mean, God does on his behalf. I don't know that he has to at that moment.
One other point is you talked about the earth opening up.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny that that doesn't solve the problem. Because the next day everybody's grumpy.
Yeah.
What solves the problem is what you said in your sermon last night with rods. And Aaron's rod rose the almond.
That was Rabbi Caruso taught about the rods. Yes, absolutely.
His challenge is almost to the Levitical and Kohanim line. That's what Korach is challenging.
Mm-hmm. There's so many aspects of this that are very relatable to the modern age where people are contending for power. I was teasing earlier about the Thanksgiving table, but that is what it's felt like the last couple of months. I'm talking about as we join forces and unify as a new temple. People have been asking me everywhere I go, how do you feel? And I said, I feel a little bit like when you're approaching Thanksgiving and you're wondering, is everybody going to be all right this year? Is everybody on the same page? Is there going to be some source of contention, or people are going to go after each other? Now, of course, that's not always how Thanksgiving is. I'm just saying that it's the source. It's a time of coming together as family, and we're not always sure of ourselves, of how people's attitude, how people's sensitivities will raise up. We were just looking there at Rabbi Geller, and I want to add that in a part of the passage that isn't in front of you, she adds the following, and I think this is where a lot of our commentaries can really get much more personal as we think about what's in us today, as we yearn to kind of control the sense of chaos that comes with change, or that comes with shifting balances of power and shifting settings where power is illustrated. Rabbi Geller adds, think about this. Each of us is both Moses and Korach. The Moses in us is wise, visionary, and trusting. Or, from the questioning side of the debate, authoritarian, power-hungry, and dictatorial. Moses, from the viewpoint of believers, represents our best self and is the guy who's right. And the Korach inside of us, from the point of view of religious faith, is our cynical, dark, negative voice. Korach is the dark side, the part of ourselves that undermines us and stands in our way of being the person we really want to become. In other words, there's a Korach in us, somebody capable of drawing the attention to themselves, of illustrating their lusts for power, for attention in the worst of ways. We all have that kind of pathos somewhere inside of us. And yet, Rabbi Geller is also adding, we also have this more visionary stance, this more I can step back and see a bigger picture. And it's a negotiation, isn't it? It doesn't have to be in the setting of a religious community. It's just a very personal setting. But there's other settings where we are just where we struggle because we show the most raw part of ourselves. The raw part of ourselves doesn't always have the imposing, lunging stance of Korach against his cousin Moses. Sometimes it's showing massive amounts of vulnerability. Raising your voice, slamming the door, dramatic pronouncements. Again, standing before a chuppah, I will often advise people that if you're going to choose to make one of those showdowns in your family, try not to do it at a major event like a wedding. If you want it to be electrified, dramatized at a higher level, do it at a wedding. Say something like, if you do this, I won't come to the wedding. Oh, that'll be remembered. And it'll worsen the impact than you wanted it to, in most cases. You can electrify it. We all have that part in us. If we don't ever show it, then we're probably not human. We're probably working on not humane instincts, I should say. We're real. There's, in the course of rabbinic tradition, the notion of having within us a yetzer tov, a instinct for placing things into order and into a more beautiful assembly, instinct for goodness, for choosing goodness, Yetzer Tov, and we also have Yetzer Hara, an instinct for hara means for evil or for self-importance. Yetzer Hara is mistaken, I think, if we think of it as an evil impulse that's always doing bad. According to the rabbis, the Yetzer Hara is responsible for our ability to procreate. There's some part of us that is determined in a positive way by the Yetzer Hara. We need balance. And here, as substitutes for that, Rabbi Geller is adding the sort of the Korach side of us and the Moses side, and examining them both as positives and as worthy of criticism. I think it's true. There's multi-dimensions to this. It's interesting to consider as we're navigating this period where we're trying to establish community norms of figuring out what's the right way, what's the wrong way. Just a couple weeks ago, I was sitting with a temple member who's new to me, who immediately told me what I can do and what I can't. And it was really interesting to hear. So I just instead of reactivity, because it doesn't serve me in that moment, I just said, say more about that. Just tell me more. It's got to be more than you're just sitting with me to tell me what I can do and what I can't. Anybody who's known me since I was around 11 knows that telling me what I can't do is a recipe for inviting me to do it. I just wrote a whole essay about this and published it in the paper. That's why I decided, even though I was a pretty decent pitcher in Little League, I didn't like anybody calling my pitches for me. I'd be up there going, no, I'm not going to accept any of the pitches because I want to call my own pitch. I realized I was better off playing catcher. Which doesn't mean that I was calling the pitches, but I was at least, a vehicle for that from the coach, and I was involved in everything. And more or less, friends, that's how Rob Nosanchuk became a rabbi. I am a catcher. It's just where I am. If we continue with another commentary, I want to go to number 3, commentary number 3, which starts on page 2. Rabbi Rachel Cowan of blessed memory. Rabbi Cowan was the founding director of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. Really marvelous teacher. That institute, I should say, has been an incredible gift to my rabbinate. It's a reservoir of insightful spiritual practice that really places a container on Jewish leaders, lay leaders, and clergy to really direct attention to our own spiritual growth. Rabbi Cowan wrote this passage. I quoted somewhat extensively from her last night in my comments, but not this part of the passage. This is all from a commentary that she wrote inside of the Women's Torah Commentary, which is a wonderful source for study. So this is just a section of it. Again, normally we'd do more, I'd be listening to other readers more than I am today, but for the sake of the streaming, I want everybody to hear each word. Torah teaches that even though Korach dies, his descendants live on, and we certainly see them today. Cynical, political, religious, and communal leaders cloaking self-interest in the language of democracy, nationalism, or God. In wielding power in such short-sighted ways, these modern-day rebels present an even greater threat to God's creation than Korach did to Moses' leadership. Now, this Torah portion urges us to be vigilant, lest such persons undermine the communities that we are called today to create and sustain. Honestly, even if you substitute Korach's name for almost any threat, I don't know a paragraph that's as astute about applying the rebellions of biblical time to today as that one. It's really astute. It's not overreaching and it's not left or right. It's about the cynicism that guides some leaders. And it's not only public leaders who react as Korach today. We too live with an ongoing conflict. Now we're back to sort of a Freudian explanation around this. An ongoing conflict between an inner Moses and an inner Korach, between humility and arrogance, between selflessness and selfishness. And until we can hear the difference between those two voices, our actions will not be effective in countering the power of the Korachs at large in the world. We need to be clear when it is the voice of our needy, small-minded self that's advising us to act, and when it is the wise voice that speaks from our deepest and best values and truth. We need to establish a practice of reflection to discern which voice is guiding us. So, the last time I taught this passage was to a class just before Passover. It was a happy circumstance because I didn't remember that this basically had strong parallels to the parable of the children at the Passover Seder. Should we listen to the wise child within us, or the wicked child? Should we listen to the voice of perspective, or the voice of, she calls our needy, small-minded self? There's a piece here where I think Rabbi Cowan is getting at is that we turn every contention that might be otherwise seen as legitimate into a personal subject of being accused. Isn't that aggravating? When you're fighting with someone and you do have a legitimate difference and you are not criticizing them as a person, but it's not as easy as saying, this is not about you. How do you convince someone it's not about them? You have to show them. It's not something you can just explain, right? I mean, you could try, but you really have to build up a reservoir of trust between you and anybody who you're contending with, where they realize later that, oh yeah, they just had a legitimate difference with me. I'm mentioning this because it's a principle that I think is important to leaders and community members beginning to build up expectations of one another in a new community, in any community, frankly. And that is that we're going to, in a community, come up against people that irritate us, that get under our skin, that we wouldn't on purpose choose to sit next to and say, good Shabbos. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm sure we're sitting against plenty of lovely people today and throughout Shabbos, but we might otherwise come across people who it's just even hard to explain. Sometimes just by their presence, they get to us. And then we're having a discussion that requires different perspectives, and that person has the nerve to raise their hand and say, I don't agree with you, Chad. No, it doesn't have to be about Chad, but I don't agree with you, Chad. This is where Chad has to pull back and say, wait a minute, I don't really appreciate this person, but let me listen. Let me listen carefully to see what is the substance of what I'm hearing. And if I'm not sure if I'm being personally attacked, maybe instead of responding with a sense of judgment, I should respond with even more curiosity. Say more about that, I could say. Or some other invitation to speak. Or could we talk about this offline a little? I'd like to learn more, right? And the reason for that is because sometimes the person who actually irritates the devil out of us is in the moment just expressing a legitimately different point of view than ours. And that is beautiful when we can find it. I don't mean it beautiful like, my goodness, I could go skipping down the meadow with that news. But it sure would make for a whole lot of more sense as we try and lead projects, as we try and get things done. Because hypothetically, you try and put me on a team with somebody with whom I wouldn't necessarily get along, and I'm going to say, nah, I'd rather not. Somebody else could partner with that one. But that's actually where this metaphor lives out most productively, I think, in the setting of study. Now today, as I said earlier, it's a little bit more teacher-student, than a little more vertical than I would normally like. We would normally do a little bit more one-to-one discussion, but the ideal in Jewish study is that we do study with someone who presses the buttons, who makes our voice rise just enough. And when you're at a yeshiva or any kind of Beit Midrash where people are studying Torah and they're studying in partnerships, there's a hum of sound. There's a lot going on. And study partners can care for one another while deepening their understanding of very different points of view. The best modern illustration of this probably is Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia, right? Who as adjudicators were deeply divided, but respected the substance of the knowledge and the discernment and the character of one another and their mutual regard for the orchestra and the opera and the fine things that enable a justice to step back and say, I'm more than the force of the law. I'm part of the human experience. That's a celebrity example of it, but I think that we can see if we might be able to model that within our community to get even closer sometimes to those who might otherwise just jab us from time to time. That actually is coming not so far off. Last night we marked the first night of Tammuz, which means soon is Av, which means after that Elul, the month leading us up towards the High Holy Days. May they be a couple of months off. But that month of leading towards the High Holy Days, Elul, we are directed by Jewish tradition to get closer to the people with whom we've had contention, with whom we've had heat. Yes, of course, we want to try and offer them forgiveness. Yes, of course, we want to try and seek forgiveness. But imagine someone getting closer to you, sitting closer, and say, Steve, I just want to say, I've been thinking about this last year, and I forgive you. That probably irritates you even worse, right? For what? What do you forgive me for, right? But getting closer increases the chance that we might actually come to a place where we recognize one another's tshuva, that we have turned from the angriest of our ways, turned from our most irresponsible of selves, our most Korach-type impulses to just rebel against one another for sake of self and self-aggrandizement, and been able to come through things. Actually, that is ideally the source of the most authentic relationships in our lives. Go back in your own history and think about the most substantive, lasting, enduringly meaningful relationships in your lives. Almost all of them are ones that went through something, where you were experiencing something, a hardship, and they were there for you, or they weren't. And you were able to challenge them on it, or you were able to thank them for it. Either way, when you go through something, that's when you know you have a real relationship. When you just adore someone, you very often are just expressing infatuation. You haven't penetrated until you've been able to accept one another's tshuva. Now, Korach has not granted here an opportunity to do tshuva. Why? Well, biblical composers clearly wanted there to be a sense of, hey, don't go that far. You went too far, he says to Moses, but he went too far even as he was saying it. I would hope that if people get irritated, get upset, get agitated, especially by the prospect of change, someone new is in a position to influence my sacred community, someone is taking up space, too much space, that we'll not, I'm not talking about hiding our thoughts, but we'll just consider them an extra moment in ways that Korach might have been able to more diplomatically, more thoughtfully approach his cousin and enhance the moment rather than subject himself to essentially the threat in the Bible of capital punishment. I mean, a pretty severe form, by the way. We're going to open the earth and swallow you and everybody behind you. That's pretty intense. David, did you have a comment? Just checking.
Oh, well, yeah. My comment on the whole story is,
Yep.
And therefore, the text is saying, Moses good, Korah bad.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is something of a setup, that if we didn't have the book in front of us and we just saw Moses and Korah, we might have a different perspective on the story.
Yeah.
Which is that Korah is standing up for the principle of the democracy. And so, to me, it feels a bit of a cheat to tell the story of Korah, because it's, the author is saying, okay, don't stand up for democracy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's.
There's a right and a wrong in religion, and you gotta listen to Moses, because he knows what he's talking about, and you don't.
Yeah. It's a setup, you were saying. That we know that this is very Tarzan-like, Korach bad, Moses good, They could be almost grunted out, that simplicity. But it's not that. There's a legitimate difference of view, and Korach blows it. He blew his stack. It's, if someone so aggressively treats you, it doesn't matter how meaningful and substantive their disagreement with you is. If they so madden you by virtue of their disrespect, you're never going to hear the gist of what they're getting across. And we should, ideally, like it's been commented here by Rabbi Geller, we should look at the case that he's making and say, yeah, I agree. Nobody should be holier than anybody else. But that doesn't, it's like he's not paying attention to the setting in which he's in. Getting so electrified by the heat of the moment. This happened, and at the risk of turning it political with almost no moments left, a few years ago, when President Obama was in office, I'm mentioning this because this coming in the next couple of weeks, this is, I think, going to be happening again, but not probably on the same scale. The Prime Minister of Israel was invited by Congress to speak. The Obama administration turned to that and said, well, he's running for office, and we don't place leaders who are running for office at the rostrum of power of Congress. We're not taking sides in all of this. And of course, it became personal, and everybody started heated discussions about whether or not, ostensibly, it doesn't matter whether, you can substitute any president's name here, whether or not the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Israel should be friendly with one another or not. I mean, it became so heated, so personal, so many accusations on each side that everybody forgot the substance of what Prime Minister actually said and the visual of having him stand before Congress and plead with the world to not look the other way at Iran's horrendous support for terror was very real. That was set aside. I'm not saying that anybody acted well in this manner. Netanyahu, no. Obama, no. Everybody acted like very childish. But the substance of what was being offered at the rostrum of Congress was something worth hearing, one way or the other. We got caught up in the theatrics of it. So we are now perhaps suffering some of those consequences, because after all, Iran is the major fuel behind Hamas. And I only wish and pray for us to come to a better situation than we're in with all of that, one where all peoples in the Middle East and around the world can radiate the kind of peace and hope we want. Again, as I mentioned to you as we began today, what a privilege to be with you, cutting our time just a little narrower than I might otherwise, because we have a wedding rehearsal in here in just a few minutes, and Cantor Sibo was at the door a moment ago going, I can't tell you exactly what our format will be next week for Shabbat Torah study, but it will be similar in the sense that there'll be two offerings at this hour. But as I said earlier, we're going to be starting to offer some Shabbat morning worship opportunities outside of the bar and bat mitzvah experiences. we're going to be offering multiple study opportunities, not just with me or Rabbi Klein, but with Rabbi Melbaum and with Cantor Sibo and others. Watch for the electronic newsletters. Reach out to our temple staff. Let them know if you're not getting those, because after all, they're coming from a new email address that you might be hitting spam with. I wish you all a really peaceful and joyful Shabbat. May it renew you and restore you for the week ahead. Shabbat shalom, everyone. You're most welcome. I'm happy to take any back if you want me to have them, but are you welcome to have them? I won't take more than I can. It's a temporary sin. And frankly, we all have that capacity to walk up and make a person. No, that's true. That's true. But you know, there's a voice we use when we're calling the car dealership for the first time. Sing more about the deals you had right now. And the voice we call when we're aggravated is, oh, get out with the guy who seems to be double talking to us. And we don't speak in our fast self. You know, that never happens. And sometimes you take ourselves a little too seriously and have to bullshit.
Okay, friends, can I have your attention? Can everybody hear me? Okay. All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have you walk in, and I'm going to show you where you're going to stand. Then we're going to rehearse walking out, walking in again, and walking out again. And that should be good. Okay? So what's going to happen first, I'm going to come in first. So music's playing, I'm going to come in. And Michael, when you see me turn around and nod to you, then you and your parents will come in. So come on in. This is just Michael and his parents. And you know what, you guys, you can hold his hand or his arm. Just don't look like you're carrying him off to the gallows. Okay? Beautiful. You're going to come right about here. A little bit closer. Beautiful. You're going to stop. You're going to give your son a hug or a kiss, whatever you guys do. Okay? Beautiful. Lovely. And then the two of you are going to come right here next to me by this pole. And Michael, you're going